Welcome to our very first episode of season 2 of our podcast here at Education Design Lab. Here at the lab, we are a diverse team with an expertise in higher education who believes that designing models from the learner perspective can help address equity and skills gaps in the world of work, and that education is the most important lever for economic mobility. My name is Ayana Conway, and I am the social media and community specialist here at Education Design Lab, and I will be your lovely host for this episode. Thank you all for tuning in to our podcast. So excited to finally be on season 2. Season 1 was amazing. We had 6 episodes and all of our guests were fabulous. And it was just a great season to pilot our podcast. Now, our very first guest for season 2 is actually Miriam Kalk. You may or may not know her, but she is the head of design practice here at Education Design Lab. Just a little brief introduction of her, which you can read more on her bio on our website at eddesignlab.org. But Miriam relishes the opportunity to contribute her experience with human-centered design and equity-centered design. In her role, Miriam supports the lab's ongoing iteration of its design approach and facilitates capacity building to bring this approach to life. She also leads the lab's community of practice strategy, helps facilitate internal and external learning about equity-centered design, and has spearheaded the infusion of self-determination theory, which we will get into in this podcast, into the lab's design approach. So, without further ado, please help me welcome Miriam Kalk.
Hello.
Hi, Miriam. How are you? How are you feeling?
Hi, I'm good. Yeah, excited to be here. Thank you for having me. Really grateful.
Of course. Well, welcome to the Labs podcast. We are officially on season 2. And you are our first guest for episode 1 of season 2. And we are so excited to have you. You are also here as a guest because you are about to do something the lab has never done before, which is present a session at South by Southwest EDU. So how are you feeling about that? Are you excited? Are you nervous? What's going on?
I'm really excited. I'm an Austin, Texas native. I grew up here and live here now and just love this conference. Super excited to get to go again. And what a privilege and an honor to get to present on behalf of the lab. So this is the thing we've hoped for and worked for a long time. So just really grateful that I get to do it. And it's such an interesting group of people who attend South by, a huge group that ends up going to South by Southwest EDU. Really diverse in terms of, people working across all different kinds of education across the country, people in workforce, people all different kinds of organizations and institutions. So just always look forward to this conference every year and can't wait to see who we get to meet through this presentation too. So a little bit of nerves, of course, because I want to do a good job, but mostly just, super grateful and excited.
Yeah, I got the opportunity to attend last year, and it is humongous how big the EDU version of South by Southwest. I can only imagine the official version, how 10 times bigger that is.
Yeah, the other 2 weeks are the city's packed. I think we were looking yesterday and over 8,000 people came last year. So it'd be really exciting to see how many folks come this year, probably even more.
Yeah, especially with your hometown being in Austin, which is a segue into the next question. I'm sure that's like a big, not culture shock, but just like overwhelming having that many people in your city during that time.
Oh, yeah, we have, there's a lot of stuff that happens in Austin. We have a lot of music festivals and, South by has the education conference and film and music and other parts of South by as well. So it's the 2 weeks following the education conference are packed. So it's a fun time where the city is, it's vibrant all the time, but even more energetic and full of interesting people during March every year. So super fun.
Yeah, highlight of going last year was definitely the Tex-Mex. I've never had it before, and it's so good. It's so good. I've never had Mexican food. I live in Arizona and I've never had
Yeah,
Mexican food that is better than Texas. It's so freaking good. So good.
it is good. That is the thing I love about Austin is just we have an incredible food scene here. Every city does in their own way, but we have just such an amazing diverse mix of folks who live here and incredible food culture as a result of that. So yeah, excited for some labbies and of course everyone else who's at the conference to get to experience a bit of that.
Now, the session that you will be presenting at South by Southwest EDU is all about the learner engagement framework, which is used across the lab. So, can you give our watchers and listeners a brief overview of what this is and why this is important?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so much to say. So this learner engagement framework that you mentioned, as you said, something that we use across all of our design work that we really spent, over the last 5 years, we spent a lot of time and energy figuring out how to infuse it into the way that we're working with institutions and their communities, and of course, learners as part of that. Um, this is not something that the lab made up. This comes from decades and decades of research by psychologists and behavioral scientists all over the world who have built this huge body of research that is called self-determination theory. So the learner engagement framework that we use at the lab is really um, a distilled set of core principles from self-determination theory that at the lab we've worked with some really of the co-founders of self-determination theory to figure out how to translate some of this, really academic research into more accessible and actionable uh, concepts and tools that people working at colleges and in workforce and really across the entire learn to work ecosystem can put into practice in their day-to-day work. But the focus of the entire framework is how can we work with learners to redesign the learning environments that they're in to more strongly support their high quality engagement in learning within those environments. So I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but spoiler alert, what so much of this research shows is that there's really three core, as we call them, drivers of engagement, of growth, belonging, and agency, which are really basic psychological needs that all humans need to have fulfilled in order for us to feel a sense of well-being, engage really deeply in different behaviors, for example, in learning.
Yeah, I'm so glad you segued into those three drivers of the learner engagement framework. Yeah. If you don't know much about the lab, or maybe you're slightly familiar, if you head to our website, shameless plug right now, eddesignlab.org, and you search learner engagement framework, the first thing that pops up, if you click on it and you download the learner engagement framework, you'll learn more about the self-determination theory, which is what I did to get this quote. But the self-determination theory is a meta theory of human behavior and motivation that has been developed through research over the past 40 years by hundreds of psychologists and behavioral scientists, which is exactly what Miriam just said. And then touched on a little bit of growth, belonging, and agency, which is kind of the pillars that hold learner engagement framework all together. So if you could dive into them just a little bit more and tell our watchers and listeners why they are so important to this learner engagement framework.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll talk about each of those three, growth, belonging, and agency, that you just mentioned in a little bit more detail. Even those terms, growth, belonging, and agency, are words that we at the lab have translated from the academic literature to be a little bit more accessible and usable based on our work, over the last 10, 11 years with institutions across the country, and with the blessing of some of the leaders who are working on the research behind this theory. So they're all equally important in terms of learners' experience and well-being. I'll start with growth because that's often where I start. In the literature, the word that folks use for growth is actually competence. So the way that we talk about growth as an engagement driver in our work at the lab and our use of the engagement framework is that supporting a learner's sense of growth is really all about supporting them making progress toward goals and hopes in a future that matters to them. So it's really important for learners to feel a sense of self-efficacy, to feel like they can succeed in the learning environments that they're part of, and that they can see the connection between the things that they're doing, they're learning today, and where they're trying to head in the future, feeling like they have a sense of momentum and feeling like this really matters in terms of, what's meaningful for them. Belonging is the second one. In the literature, this is called relatedness. Belonging is a word that is used so much by educators. And I know that in a wonderful way, there's more and more research and discussion of, the importance of focusing on belonging. And the way that we talk about belonging, we're really referring to a learner feeling like they are embraced as their authentic selves by their learning environment and their community. Like they have positive, meaningful relationships with people in perhaps different roles across that community within their learning environment. And the last engagement driver is agency. Again, not stated in any order, but in the literature, agency is called autonomy. But we use the term agency because it feels a little bit more, again, accessible for folks. Agency is really about learners feeling like they're in the driver's seat of their learning experience. That certainly means that it's really important to support our learners' sense of agency, to ensure that they get to make choices that are meaningful for them about their learning experience. So for some learners, that may be, what pace do I get to work with? Do I get to do my learning online or in person? The choices that matter to an individual learner could be really personal to them and different from learner to learner. We also know that it actually would be really overwhelming if you made a learner decide everything for themselves. So again, it's that combination of choice, but also alignment with, what a learner's interests and needs and experiences are.
Well, thank you for giving a brief description of all those. I think it ties it all together, and it's very tangible for everyone, which I'm sure we will dive in a little bit more later. I'm like spilling all the teasers today. So I know I stated earlier that we invited you as a guest on our podcast because you are hosting a session at South by Southwest EDU. But the real reason we invited you was because we wanted to understand how every learner, or at least how to help every learner, get a sense of growth, belonging, and agency. So, can you tell us what is something you have learned working with learners that have participated in the learner engagement framework at the lab?
That's such a good question. In alignment with the lab's design approach, which if there are listeners or watchers who are newer to that, we really care deeply about and prioritize across all of work as much as possible direct engagement with learners who are most deeply impacted by the problems that we're trying to tackle. So, as you said, Ayana, working directly with learners to figure out how to bring the engagement framework, this focus on supporting their sense of growth, belonging, agency to life, has been incredibly, incredibly central to the way that we have approached this work. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that there's not any perfect recipe that is going to make this happen for everyone.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the complexity, of course, as we know in education design, but also the beauty of this framework is that fulfillment of these basic psychological needs or engagement drivers of growth, belonging, and agency has everything to do with the very personal, individual relationship between a learner and the environment. I do a lot of work, for example, and have for my whole time at the lab over the last 5 years with single moms in community colleges. What can we learn from, individual and groups of single moms about what might support their sense of growth, belonging, and agency? And how might that actually differ amongst different single moms? Of course, every single mom is a unique and individual learner as well, right? There's, there's no, or if we're working with rural learners, right? Rural learners are also not a monolith. So if we're thinking about that context of working with single moms in community colleges, it could be helpful, for example, to not just only think about single moms, which are already, of course, a population that's been underinvested in and underserved in post-secondary ed historically, but to perhaps focus specifically, in a given institutional context on single moms who are from low-income backgrounds, maybe are working multiple jobs right now to try to keep their families afloat, and maybe don't have a lot of family support locally to help out with childcare, right? There's a lot of assumptions that we often make in doing education design, right, about the kinds of support that we think that people may have, that we think that they can rely on, that then if we're not checking those assumptions and figuring out how to support growth, belonging, and agency for those very particular single moms I mentioned, then probably other single moms are going to benefit as well. Probably other parenting learners are going to benefit, and all working adult learners, and so on and so forth. So when we use that concept of designing at the margins and pair that with these core concepts of the engagement framework, we've seen in many different design contexts that there can be a really incredible community-wide impact on these engagement drivers for different learners.
That was an amazing explanation. I think it gives a very broad overview of kind of like your work at the lab. You touched on single mom success, which is not a different project, but I think if I'm not mistaken, the learner engagement framework is basically what that is. It's infused within single mom success.
Yeah, that was really the first project context in which we brought it to life.
Centering the learner is what the lab is all about. And you gave really concrete examples of how to do that, especially within the space of education design, which I think is clear and sometimes not clear, but it's also, I think it's a tough job because you have those different battles that you're battling with, and being able to not make assumptions and have concrete evidence is all a part of education design.
Absolutely. There's no perfection in it, right? And that's why we have in our design approach, right, these core modes of design of understand and ID and prototype are helping us all the time figure out like, okay, how do we begin and how do we infinitely adjust and continue to engage directly with those learners to guide the way that we're adjusting along the way. So yeah, it's complex.
Yeah, you gotta love the work that the lab is doing, especially your time at the lab. Based on your experience, what would be 3 tips you would have for promoting growth, belonging, and agency for learners?
Oh my God, it's so hard to pick 3 because there's so much to say. But we're all designers, right? We often call upon Creative Reaction Lab's definition. A designer is anyone who has the agency to make decisions that impact people or the environment. If you are an advisor at a college or a faculty member or an administrator, or if you're a manager of people, if you're a parent, people in so many different roles, like even beyond education, are in positions that offer them the opportunity to really bring this engagement framework to life. So many tips to say, again, depending on who we want to focus on, right? So many tips for faculty members or for administrators or for managers, all different kinds of folks. But I can touch on just a couple of things just briefly for each engagement driver. And I would put a plug, like you said before, Ayana, if folks search Learner Engagement Framework on the lab's website, you will come to that very substantial and thorough paper that we have out there, as well as some shorter resources as well, where folks can get an even deeper dive into so many ideas. One thing I'll say that is really critical for so many learners that really plays into supporting all 3 engagement drivers for them. Supporting basic tangible needs is actually really, really critical. If we're thinking about a learner's sense of growth, for example, and remember that being so tied in with, do learners feel like they can succeed in their education environments today? Do they feel like they are and can continue to grow? It would entirely make sense if a learner did not feel that way if they're experiencing food or housing insecurity, right? Or up against an impossible situation with childcare, or, a really difficult financial situation. So again, this is a question we get a lot of the time, thinking about these basic psychological needs that are these engagement drivers or basic tangible needs. It's not an either or, it has to be a both and. Right? When we're thinking about holistic support for learners, supporting them engaging deeply and over the long term in education, and again, their sense of well-being in learning and in work, it's so important to think about both of those. So that's one thing, that cuts across all 3 of the engagement drivers that I would definitely want to mention. If we continue on growth, offering frequent formative feedback for learners in the classroom, ensuring that they always understand that there's a path forward from them, that they're getting information about how they can continue to grow and shift what they're doing, keep improving, but feeling like any feedback they're getting isn't judgmental or evaluative in a negative way is really, really important. It's also really important, and I think we see this in like our X credit work, for example. This is a lot of what inspired that work at the lab, really focusing on, right, how can we award learners credit for experiences that they have outside of quote unquote traditional academic or educational environments, when we can make it easier for learners to have the skills that they have built, regardless of where or how they built those, recognized by our education systems, and then allow them to really have the most appropriate starting and launching point from there in their learning journey, that can be incredible for supporting their sense of growth. That also can really support their sense of belonging, because that can make them feel more seen, and more appreciated and more understood. It's critical for institutions to work with the folks who are employed there to build really inclusive cultures, right? Investing in anti-oppressive practices, investing in DEIB training, in empathy training for all faculty and staff is a thing that we have seen, unsurprisingly, is really, really important for those institutions being able to support sense of belonging, especially for learners who have been underinvested and underserved, underrepresented in colleges historically. It's also really important in terms of sense of belonging for relationship building to be at the core, or opportunities for that at least, to be at the core of learners' experiences. And we've seen that it can be especially powerful if learners have the opportunity to build relationships with people who can have different roles in their learning experience. So people who are in more mentorship roles, perhaps that's faculty, right? Or even peer mentors, certainly other learners. I can't tell you how many single moms have said to us, single moms who are in college have said, I thought I was the only single mom who's enrolled at this institution. And in fact, nationwide, 10 or 11% of learners across all colleges are single moms. So certainly that learner is never the only single mom, right? So the more opportunities we can offer to learners to build meaningful relationships with other learners, and especially other learners who may be going through similar things that they are, that can be really, really helpful for their sense of belonging. And then on agency, and again, so much to say. Oh my gosh, it's so hard to pick. It's really important to support learners aligning the learning pathways that they're on with the goals that matter to them. And again, supporting them seeing how that alignment is happening on a big picture scale, like thinking about the whole program that they're part of, and what skills and competencies and career opportunities is that going to unlock for them, and how does that map to their goals. But also, and this is tied to growth as well in some ways, seeing how each class that they're taking is going to help them along that path as well, right? So that alignment in a big picture and little picture way in terms of their learning and their goals is really important for their sense of agency. It's also really important, like I mentioned before, to give learners choices about things that matter in their learning experiences for them. For some learners and many folks, it could be choices about what kind of learning products they create in their classes, right? Letting people pick a topic to focus on if they're writing a paper, or a thing to build if they have to, create something as a product for a class. Choosing the time that they're attending classes, giving them more scheduling flexibility, letting them choose, the pace and the place of learning that's happening for them. There's also a lot of really important supportive structure that can support a sense of agency. So if you're going to give learners more time flexibility in their learning, also offering them the opportunity to choose to have reminders about things sent to them can be really helpful for helping them buy into that kind of structure that is going to help them keep making progress in the way that they want to, and it's going to work for them, but doesn't make them feel just like out in the open on their own doing this by themselves. So that combination of flexibility and structure is really, really important for sensitivity.
That was so in-depth and so good.
Thanks.
Oh my goodness. Our watchers and listeners are going to take away so much from those tips, and I hope no, they are. I really hope that we get a lot of views on this episode, and that it really helps benefit other institutions within the higher ed space, because you are dropping some bombs and gems on this episode, Miriam.
Thank you. It's my greatest love in work. So.
No, we can clearly tell that you're passionate about it, and it's so good to see you really kind of dive into all of the work that you've been doing at the lab, essentially. Now, we are towards the end of our episode, unfortunately. I wish we had more time with you, Miriam, but at the end of every episode, we like to ask our guests some sort of thought-provoking question.
Ooh.
And your question is, How do you envision the learner engagement framework at the lab benefiting higher education or other learning providers 10 years from now? So in 2034.
Oh my
Wow,
gosh.
that sounds crazy.
That's wild that that's a 10 years. Oh, such a good question. I mean, my dream through our work at the lab is that over time we can support people across the learn to work ecosystem using this framework in their daily work and life as like a lens through which to understand the experiences that people they are engaging with, learners specifically, and a lens through which to shape how they're collaborating directly with those folks to more strongly support their sense of growth, belonging, and agency, right? How can having those three engagement drivers as guiding lights support people rethinking, you know, and redesigning, right, how systems operate today?
Mm-hmm.
If we focus on optimizing for satisfaction of those drivers, right, really strongly supporting every learner's sense of growth, belonging, agency by trying to figure out, like we were talking about before, how to support those engagement drivers for learners who have been underinvested in and underserved in different systems historically, then systems could really reshape themselves, right? And there's so much to say. We didn't talk about this as much before, but when you really strongly support someone's sense of growth, belonging, and agency, and all kinds of amazing outcomes, certainly in terms of learners' engagement immediately, but also sustained engagement over the long term in their learning environments. There's also so much research that shows that there are improvements in persistence, in attainment rates of degrees and credentials, in goal attainment for the learner, and in career outcomes, right? I often think about and try to frame for folks that supporting the sense of growth, belonging, and agency is both a means to an end and an end itself, right? Through doing that, we know that you can support learners unlocking all these amazing outcomes that they care about and many institutions care about as well. And these are also the core ingredients of well-being, right? And isn't supporting every individual's well-being and self-determination of their futures like what this work is all about and why so many of us work in education? So it's like making me teary. Oh my gosh, this is why I love this work so much, is because it's so simple. And yet, of course, we talked about how complex it can be, right? But if we can just support folks internalizing and starting to bring to life a focus on growth, belonging, and agency in their work and doing that in an equity-centered way, right? I really believe that our whole education system and the learn to work ecosystem could look really different in 10 years. So I don't know what it'll look like, right? We have to ask learners what it should look like to figure that out, right? That's what we're trying to do in all of our work in the lab. So
way to pivot back to centering it to the learner. I think that would be a great question to ask someone, a learner currently in the space, whether single mom or adult learner who didn't go to post-secondary right after high school, or even just a high schooler in dual enrollment, asking them that question and what they envision learner engagement will look like 10 years from now. Kudos to you for that pivot. But
yeah. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. This has been so fun.
Of course. And you almost made me get teary-eyed at the end with that response. So thank you again, Miriam, for taking the time out of your busy schedule. Everyone, Miriam is busy, especially preparing for South by Southwest. That is a big feat. So thank you again. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for tuning in to our podcast. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to check out the audio version on Buzzsprout, which you can all find on our website. So, bye.